Canada's First Nations people, or Aboriginal people, have had a long history that includes rich culture and spiritual traditions. They have formed Canada to make it a warm, beautiful, and welcoming country as it is today. Aboriginal people play a vital role in Canada's formative history and cultural identity. However, their traditions were altered and even taken away upon the arrival of the European settlers. They had to abandon their homes to attend residential schools where they were forced to live and learn the European cultures and values. First Nations were not guaranteed proper health care and suffered through poverty and inequality. Even today, Aboriginal people still do not have the same rights and freedoms as the other Canadians. The disposition of Aboriginal people's land and the imposition of modes of government began a cycle of social, physical, and spiritual destruction. Throughout Canada's history, overcoming injustice to Aboriginal people has been a constant struggle, which has demonstrated that time does not always ensure change.
In the late 1800s, the Canadian government and church members began to remove Aboriginal children from their original schools and placing them in what was called an industrial school, but now it's called residential. These schools were the most effective way to ruin and destroy the race and culture of young Aboriginal children. What proved to be even more destructive than industrial school was the emotional, physical, and sexual abuse that many of the children received. Ever since this occurred to the young Aboriginal children, you never really get to know the Aboriginal culture and race, but you get to know the European race and culture off by heart. The industrial school closed in 1996, but still only 8% of 25 to 34-year-olds that are Aboriginal had a complete university degree.
The Aboriginal people experience a disproportionate burden of many infectious diseases. In the 16th century, when Europeans came to Canada, they brought along many foreign diseases such as typhoid, diphtheria, and cholera. These diseases had a devastating effect on the First Nations, who were neither immune to the disease or knew how to treat them and cure them. The miserable conditions contributed to many being sick, which resulted in an increased death rate. Healthcare was traditionally saved for those deemed deserving it, which were mainly white European settlers.
First Nations people in Canada had to overcome many challenging battles and suffered in poverty and inequality. Roots of poverty for Aboriginal communities can be traced back to the forced relocation of Aboriginal land, also known as reserves. Recently, in 2012, Canada's First Nations had a protest called Idle No More. The purpose of this protest was a peaceful revolution to honor Indigenous sovereignty and to protect the Aboriginal land and water. Even Attawapiskat Chief Teresa Spence inspired the entire world to get involved when she began her liquid diet hunger strike. Aboriginal people wanted a reaction to the legislative abuse by the federal government. In addition, due to the infrastructure, economy setup, no planning, and destruction of traditional ways of living, combined with poor organization of the reserves, resulted in a huge economic failure. On average, 55.6% of Aboriginal people living in Canada were suffering through poverty in 1995, and 52% of Aboriginal children were poor in 2003. Many First Nations people died due to lack of shelter, food, healthcare, and money. Today, this injustice still continues in Canada. Child welfare programs for Aboriginal people are slashed with no guarantee of return. There are also a high number of unresolved missing people cases from 1990 that have still not been resolved. 800 Aboriginal women have been missing for over 2 decades, and there still have not been any leads or interest. There are families that want answers and want to know where their loved ones are, but no one is putting interest into this matter. Aboriginal injustice is a prime example of how history is not always about change. In summation, Aboriginal people struggle to overcome injustice has been a constant battle, which has demonstrated that time does not always ensure change. Aboriginals should have been treated equally, considering that they have born and brought up this wonderful country called Canada. Sadly, the Aboriginals were treated poorly and continue to be mistreated horribly. First Nations were not guaranteed proper health care and suffered excruciating poverty, inequality, and were put in residential schools where their cultures and beliefs were demolished. Lastly, Aboriginal people are human beings just like us. They eat, sleep, drink, and have the same blood just like we do. They are humans and deserve the right to freedom, equality, and happiness. First Nations should not be facing this injustice and overt discrimination for nothing. This is why history does not always ensure change.